Well, welcome to the Carlin Sales Pro Green Plus BuyerFest 2020 by means of um, digital, might say. The topic of this presentation is going to be called Update on New Pesticides, Insecticides, and Miticides. My name is Raymond Cloyd. I'm a professor and extension specialist in horticultural entomology at Kansas State University in the Department of Entomology. Okay, so let me give you an overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then we're going to talk about new pesticides. And again, I'm going to focus in on insecticides and miticides for use in greenhouse production systems. Well, for the introduction, greenhouse-grown horticultural crops are susceptible to a wide range of insect and mite pests, many times simultaneously. We have gotten away from talking about individual insect and mite pests, and what we're doing now is talking about complexes of insect and mite pests, and this is because most of the production in greenhouses are polyculture or multi-crops grown simultaneously. Consequently, that leads to the prospects of encountering different insect and mite pests. Well, the major insect or mite pests that are encountered in greenhouse-grown horticulture crops are the big eight: aphids, thrips, fungus gnats, whiteflies, shoreflies, leaf miners, mealybugs, and mites. These are the major ones, although there might be some other incidental ones that other growers will encounter in greenhouse production systems. The primary means of dealing with insect and mite pest populations in general is the applications of insecticides and miticides. Well, why is that? Well, insecticides and miticides are generally cost effective, easy to apply, and there's a psychological satisfaction in knowing that you've killed a bunch of bugs after the spray application, or at least you hope. So when we look at overall what we call plant protection, the primary strategy, although not limited to this, is the use of insecticides and miticides. Well, in the early years, we used to have a plethora of new insecticides and miticide introduced every year. That picture has changed. And the reason being is because of the cost of development and introduction, which could range up to $300 million for a single active ingredient, and then the time period from initial discovery to release, and that's about 8 to 11 years. So if you take into account the patent, which is 17 years, you can see that companies have about 6 years to recoup their investment. And that is one of the reasons why many of the insecticides and miticides labeled for use in greenhouse production systems are expensive. Remember that greenhouses are specialty crop, and they're not like the cash cows of corn, cotton, soybean, and rice and wheat. So this picture is probably going to be the same for many years. That is, we're not going to get new active ingredients, or we're not going to get the number that we used to get in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. Well, the other idea or the other challenge we're presented with is that we've gone from broad spectrum pesticides, and I think many of you remember a product called Temic. In fact, I know that many of you wish it was back on the market. Well, we've gone from these broad spectrum pesticides that killed all the insect and mite pests to we call narrow spectrum pesticides. And these are ones that will kill either one, two insects or mites. Again, they don't have the level of activity that the broad spectrum pesticides do. However, greenhouse producers are still dealing with the same multiple pest complex regardless of the change in pesticides available. Well, what constitutes a new pesticide? Well, in general, a new pesticide should have a novel mode of action, how it kills the insect. And so that's why new is in quotes, because what I'm going to talk about are pesticides that are really not new overall. And I'll go through it very in detail during the course of this presentation. Well, what I want to talk about are these 6 new pesticides. I'm going to talk about Altus, Picana, Novato, Ventigra, Cyrissa, and then Pradia. I think at the end of the presentation, you're going to come to the conclusion that these are really not what I consider new pesticides. So let's talk about Altus. Altus, the active ingredient is fluoroperotifron. It's registered for use in greenhouses and outdoors. The RAI is 4 hours. The RAI is the restricted entry interval, except in California where the RAI is 12 hours. The targeted insect pests include aphids, leafhoppers, mealybugs, plant bugs, psyllids, certain scales, and whiteflies. Now, this is important to understand. The mode of action is a nicotinic acetoreceptor modulator. This number is the IRAC designation. IRAC stands for Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. Now, we all want to know what are the impact of these on bees, primarily honeybees. Well, the bee activity associated with Altus is based on this label information. It's toxic to bees in laboratory studies via oral exposure. However, not toxic to bees through contact exposure, and field studies conducted with this product have shown no effects on honeybee colony development. Let me give you a caveat. This is a new active ingredient, so the level of research on Altus is not the same as imidacloprid, which is Marathon, and the other neonicotinoids. So let me focus on the IRAC mode of action classification scheme for a moment. So when we look at the IRAC classification, the number 4 designates the nicotinic receptor modulators. Then we have these subgroups. 4A are the neonicotinoids, which is acetamiprid or Tristar, dinetefuran or Safari, imidacloprid or Marathon, and thiamethoxam or Flagship. We will talk about sulfoxaflor in a moment. But look where Altus falls. Although it is not a 4A, B, or C, being a 4D, it shares a similar mode of action as these other subgroups. So the bottom line is you cannot use or should not use Altus in a rotation program with the neonicotinoids. That is, do not use the same mode of action in succession. Well, let me go back again to the IRAC designation. 4A are the neonicotinoids. 4B is nicotine. 4C, sulfoxaflor, is one of the active ingredients in a product that was removed from the market several years ago, but it appears to be making a comeback. It's a combination of sulfoxaflor and spinoteram. And then 4D is going to be your botanilides, which is Altus. Okay, let's look at some of the work we've done with Altus against everybody's favorite pest, mealybugs. Here's a study we did looking at Altus flunicamide aurea. We did 3 applications once a week. And when it comes to dealing with mealybugs, you need to remember 2 items: thorough coverage of all plant parts, and frequency of application. You can see that after 3 weeks, Altus and flunicamide gave us 100% mortality of the citrus mealybug. Okay, now let's look at some of the drench applications, that is applied to the growing media. And on this chart, the very far, you can see preventative drench applications. Those are applications made before the mealybugs are on the plants. Curative applications are when the mealybugs are on the plants and then you make an application. What you can see very definitively is that we're getting very, very low mortality of mealybugs, less than 30%. And this also includes aurea. Well, why is that? Well, in our studies at Kansas State University, we have found that systemic insecticides applied as granulars or liquids to the soil or growing media are not effective on mealybugs. So in our last statement in this publication, we state, based on the result of our study, systemic insecticides are not effective against the citrus mealybug in greenhouse production systems. If you'd like some further reading, you can download this article or contact me and I will send you a PDF. Okay, here's another study we did. On the y-axis is the mean number of live mealybug nymphs and egg-laying females. We have an untreated check, Safari, Altus, and Altus. Now these are drench applications. The last application is a spray application. And you can see that the spray applications give us much higher mortality or better control of the mealybugs than the drench applications do. Again, I'm going to highlight or reiterate that when dealing with mealybugs, it's thorough coverage of all plant parts and frequency of application at least once a week. Well, we also do a lot of work with natural enemies. So what about the effect of Altus on some of the beneficial insects? Well, this is a table from one of our publications, and what we do is we do what we call the worst case scenario. We use petri dishes lined with filter paper. We basically pour a 1 milliliter aliquot of the solution. We put the adults in there, and then we assess survival after 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours. Now, the roe beetle, which is a predator of the fungus gnat larva, we rear that one, and we also looked at the efficacy or the effects on Aureus insidiosus, the insidious flower bug. Here are the 3 different rates of Altus, and you can see after 96 hours, we're getting pretty good survival. As the rate goes up, the survival is less. But what's really distinct is that Aureus is extremely susceptible to Altus. You can see after 24 hours, we were getting no survival. So what this demonstrates is that the effects of some of these materials is going to vary based on the specific natural enemy. Again, if you're having trouble sleeping and want some bedtime reading material, here's another publication you can download and get some more information about some of our work where we've looked at a wide variety of insecticides and miticides and even fungicides on roe beetle adults and insidious flower bug adults. Well, what about the effects, both directly and indirectly, on honeybees? Let's go back to the label. The label states toxic to adult bees in laboratory studies via oral exposure, however, not toxic to bees through contact exposure, and field studies conducted with this product have shown no effects on honeybee colony development. Let me reiterate something. Altus is relatively new, and the number of studies is less than those that have been done on most of the other neonicotinoids. Remember, Altus is not a neonicotinoid, but it is still in the group 4, and it has a very similar mode of action as the neonicotinoids. Well, here is one study. Savanto is the agricultural trade name for Altus or fluoroparatofon. And basically the bottom line was that under the conditions of the testing, the pesticide could be considered safe for honeybees, at least with respect to behavior studied here. Here's another study looking at the lethal and sublethal synergistic effects. And what synergistic means, when 2 materials are used together in a mixture, the effect is higher in terms of mortality than they would be by themselves. What this study showed in a nutshell is that when Altus is mixed with some of the fungicides, that increases toxicity to bees. So the statement they make at the very bottom is we suggest that pesticide risk assessments also include mixtures that are synergistic on bee behavior and survival. Okay, product number 2, Picana. And this is not a new pesticide. It's a combination of pyrethrins, which are botanical materials derived from chrysanthemum flowers, and canola oil. It's registered for use in greenhouses, shade houses, nurseries, hoop houses, and container grain nursery crops. A 12-hour REI. Target pests include aphids, mealybugs, spider mites, thrips, and whiteflies. What about the mode of action? It prolongs opening of the sodium channels, which is an IRAC designation 3A, as well as the pyrethroids, and its suffocation or membrane disruption, which is due to the canola oil. Well, what about bee activity? The product is highly toxic to bees when exposed to direct treatment on blooming crops and weeds. And I just want to stop here for a moment and talk about even if you're getting away from the neonicotinoids because of the supposed impact on bees, some of the products that are available to you are going to be just as toxic to bees as the neonicotinoids might be. So here's the label or the container picana. It's got 0.5% pyrethrins and 89% canola oil. So the question I always ask myself is, which active is actually killing the bugs? So we've done some work with picana. On the y-axis is the mean percent mortality of adult western flower thrips. And this is how we do our setup using yellow Gerber daisies. We infest them with thrips, and then we make our spray applications, and then we take plant the flowers back, destroy them, and count the number of live and dead thrips. What you can see is picana, as well as some of the other treatments, just barely we're over 40% mortality, which is really not very good. Remember, picana or pyrethrins is very sensitive to UV light degradation and doesn't really last long overall, especially in the summertime when there's high light intensity. So the next product is definitely not a new product. It's called Novato, and its active is clofentacine. Well, it was formerly called Ovation, then it was called Applause, now it's called Novato. This is a very, very selective miticide. It's registered for use in greenhouses, saran and shade houses, outdoor containers, and field-grown nursery stock. 12-hour REI, and the target pest? Mites, primarily two-spotted spider mite. Clofentacine is an ovicide. It kills the eggs, but will also have activity on larvae and nymphs. The mode of action is a growth and embryogenesis inhibitor. The IRAC designation is 10A. Now, one of the benefits of clofentacine, it has minimal negative effects on predatory mites. Product Ventigra. This might be considered a new one, but when we talk about IRAC designations, not really. The active ingredient is phytopyropron. It's registered for use in greenhouses, shade houses, interior-scapes, and can also be used in vegetable transplants. Its activity is by means of ingestion or stomach poison, and it has, we call, the translaminar activity. For those of you that don't know what translaminar means, this is what translaminar is. You spray the plant, and the material penetrates through the leaf, gets inside the leaf, and remains there depending on the active and plant type, sometimes up to 14 days. It's not a true systemic, but it gives what we call localized systemic. That means even after the residues dry and an insect like an aphid feeds on the underside of the leaves, it will ingest a lethal concentration of the active ingredient. The REI is 12 hours. The target insect pests are aphids, mealybugs, scales, and whiteflies, primarily the sucking insects or phloem feeders. The mode of action is a selective feeding blocker. It also has this other fancy name. The IRAC designation is 9D. There are some sensitive plants, including coleus, poinsettia and brack, impatiens and petunia in flower. Well, what about bee activity? Although Ventigra is not, this is the label information, although Ventigra is not acutely toxic to bees, the use of the maximum single application rate may have some short-term behavioral effects on adult bees. However, no long-term impacts on bees and colony health are expected. This is relatively new active ingredient, and was not able to find any papers out there that have looked at both the direct and indirect effects on honeybees. Well, let's go back to IRAC and show you why this is not really a new pesticide. Here are the IRAC designations of 9 and 29. Now, flunicamide used to be a 9C. It used to be in this group before the IRAC moved it to another designation, number 29. Well, pymetrozine is Endeavor, this is Rycar, and there is Ventigra. So really not a new material, very similar mode of action as the 9 and the 29 IRAC group. So our next product is called Cyrissa. Cyclinarpol is the active ingredient. It's registered for use in greenhouses, shade houses, and nurseries, and it has a 4-hour restricted entry interval, or RAII. The target insect pests include caterpillars, mealybugs, thrips, and whiteflies. The mode of action, it's a selective activation of ryanodin receptors. These products works on the muscles and they inhibit calcium entering the muscles, and that results in the insects kind of rigid because it reduces elasticity. The IRAC designation is 28. Well, what about bee activity? The label states this product is highly toxic to bees and other pollinating insects exposed to different treatment or to residues in or on blooming crops or weeds. Here is what the product label looks like. There it is, cyclinarpol, about 4.55%. Let's go back to IRAC. Is it an actually new pesticide? No. 28 is the IRAC designation, the diamides, and here we have chloronitropanol, which is aceleprene, cyclinarpol, which is mainspring, and there is Cyrissa. All three have the same mode of action. Well, we've done some research with Cyrissa, and on the y-axis is the mean percent mortality of adult western flower thrips. And what we have found, it's very effective on thrips. We've compared it with flunicamide and mainspring as a spray application. It does have some pretty good activity based on science and data that it works on western flower thrips. The last product I'm talking about is definitely not a new pesticide. It's a combination of Cyrissa and Aria, or flunicamide, which I mentioned already. It's registered for use in greenhouses, shade houses, and nurseries. Now remember, Cyrissa had a 4-hour REI, but Prodia has a 12-hour REI. The targeted insect pests include aphids, caterpillars, mealybugs, thrips, and whiteflies. The mode of action, selective activation of ryanodin receptors, or IRAC designation 28, which is cyclinarpol, which is Cyrissa. But now flunicamide, which I mentioned earlier, is a selective feeding blocker in the IRAC designation 29. Well, what about bee activity? This product is highly toxic to bees and other pollinating insects exposed to direct treatment or to residues in or on blooming crops or weeds. So again, let me reiterate that if you get away from the neonicotinoids, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to have products available that are going to be less toxic to bees. So again, here is again, on the upper right is the group 28, that's for cyclinarpol, and group 29 is for flunicamide. And here's actually Aria, which contains flunicamide, the same active ingredient in Prodia. Well, as we wind down, I thought I'd present some information you can get. Grower Talks, what they have available are these insecticide, miticide, fungicide guide, and we just updated 2020, and it's sponsored by BASF. Thank you. What is in this publication is I develop a listing of all the pest control materials for the insect and mite pest of greenhouse grown horticulture crops. I have the pest, the active ingredient or common name, trade name, REI, and the mode of action. Now, in bold is the IRAC designation, but I spell it out right after that. So again, here's spider mite. All the actives are common name. And you can see clofentacine there, which is now going to be called Novato, and the REI and the mode of action. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you all learned something. And with that, we are done.